Early childhood is sometimes referred to as the preschool years. This is a period of life after infancy and before a child begins formal schooling. This is typically from 2 to 6, maybe 7 years old. First, let's examine physical growth. There is a considerable difference between the body proportions of a child entering or exiting this stage. Toddlers tend to have larger heads and stomachs and shorter arms and legs, but a 7-year-old child tends to have longer, linear bodies on the torso lengths. The rate of physical growth in early childhood is slower than what was found in infancy. So overall physical growth is at the rate about 3 inches in height per year. About 4.5 pounds of weight is gained each year. The average 6-year-old in the United States is about 46 inches tall and weighs about 46 pounds as well. This lower growth rate translates into a smaller appetite for children between 2 and 6 years old. This diminished appetite means that children are vulnerable to nutrition deficiencies. This is particularly true if those small appetites are satisfied with foods with poor nutrition in it. Preschoolers can suffer iron deficiencies, particularly if they drink too much milk, which interferes with the body's ability to absorb iron. Children in the United States consume too many high-fat, high-sugar junk food. And while the effects of such poor nutrition might not be immediately evident to the parent, the preference of eating such insanely, intensely sugar and fatty foods is being established and can interfere with nutrition for years to come. So how can you avoid setting up an eating problem at this age group? Here are some tips directed towards establishing reasonable expectations about food and avoiding this association of psychological needs. So first, don't try to force feed your child or fight with them over food. I know this can be kind of controversial and sometimes people are very adamant about the child eating what the rest of the family member is, but just recognize that appetites vary and you should think about adjusting accordingly to the child. Keep mealtime pleasant and a time for family members to unite and enjoy one another's company. And don't become a short order chef. Think about choosing reasonable menu items that all can share. And limit choices, particularly when allowing young children to make selections. Too many options can be confusing for them, and you want to make choices or offer up choices that you're satisfied with. So if you have both items readily available in your fridge, that's when you want to do something like that. And also serve balanced meals. Take the time to think about nutrition and prepare meals that are healthy. Don't bribe the child with food. Offering certain foods as a reward can set up this hierarchy of good and bad foods, which can get in the way of their eating habits later on in life. Let's turn our attention to the brain. During early childhood, the brain continues to grow and mature. At age 2, we talked about this last video, the brain is about 75% of its adult weight. By age 6, it's about 95% of its adult weight, and by 7, it's about 100%. Changes in the child's ability to override emotional outbursts is really the focal point during this time of their life, and to coordinate movement as seen on a cortex continues to mature. So the thing for our children at this age is their visual pathways continue to be established, and the child becomes able to reproduce what is seen on a paper when drawing. The left hemisphere of the brain undergoes a growth spurt between ages 3 and 6, and it's really helping with facilitating their language skills. The right hemisphere grows throughout childhood, improving spatial skills and recognizing shapes and patterns. Gross motor skills development occupies most of the life of a young child. So at this time, they're running, they're jumping, they're swinging, learning how to ride a bike are all examples of gross motor skills. Many childhood songs combine music and words with large physical movement. So can you think of an example? How about that head, shoulders, knees, and toes? Remember that one? Young children also practice their fine motor skills by learning how to pour, use scissors, or color. Early childhood classrooms include a number of activities for improving a child's fine motor skills. Many songs and activities incorporate some of these skills. So we've all heard the song, the itsy bitsy spider, same kind of thing. It's really them practicing their motor skills. Let's continue our look at cognitive development. Here is a picture of Piaget. Recall Piaget's second stage of cognitive development. It's called pre-operational intelligence. Early childhood is a time of learning and to use thought to solve problems, and learning to know and communicate about the world through the use of symbols and their primary language. Now, the child can think about what happened several days ago or even imagine an event. Like this time would be a good example of like when a child starts to remember and play a song in their head. Being able to think about the world in this new way doesn't mean that the child is logical about how the world works, though. Pre-operational thought is called like pre-logical or before logic. So they may have tendencies to believe that everybody sees the world through their eyes. Here are some other aspects of the pre-operational thought. Children love to play out roles at this age. This type of play is called sociodramatic play, which allows the child to take on the role fully and to think about how they speak and act, as well as the kinds of props are needed to become a certain part or a character. So a child might want to reenact and be a superhero, or they might want to play house. This is all of that sociodramatic play. Centrism refers to thinking that if two events occur at the same time, one must have caused the other. Here's an image of a hospital. A child whose mother brought a baby with her when she left the hospital may think that a new visit to the same building will like produce another child because they're associating with that event and that location as this simultaneous event. Egocentrism is one of Piaget's early concepts that refers to how these children assume that everyone thinks what they do. So try reading to a child and they may ask, where am I in the story? They believe that they're at the center of the activity. Or you may hear a child ask whether a character in a movie or cartoon loves them. That's an odd question, unless you're 3 years old. Animism is thought that the objects have life-like qualities. It's an attempt to help your children distinguish between living and non-living objects. Piaget challenged children's ability to understand how to classify objects. So for example, in this image showing numerous red buttons and a single green button, you have objects that can be classified in several ways. If you ask like a 3-year-old, what are there more of, red things, green things, or buttons, the child will probably respond red things and not recognize that they're all buttons. Piaget's experiments on conservation of matter indicate that children have numerous misconceptions about the matter. So for example, if a container of water is poured into 2 different shaped containers so that the water levels now vary, the child might think that the higher water level indicates more liquid, or a child may think that if one line moves further to the right, it is more, or in one row of pennies, it's widely spaced apart, that it has more. The theory of mind is the understanding that people have different thoughts than one's own. The realization replaces their egocentrism and occurs between 3 and 5 years old, sometimes around 4 for most children. This knowledge of others' mental states can aid in some of their social relationship and their ability to build those stronger relationships with the people around them. It serves as our everyday mind reading. It can be absent or difficult for children with autism spectrum disorders. Such children may not be able to appreciate other mental states depending on the level of severity of the disorder. During this time, the vocabulary grows at the rate of 10 to 20 new words per day, and they have a vocabulary approximately about 10,000 words by age 6. However, children do not have a complete understanding of words. So for example, a child may not understand the expression time flies simply means that time passes really quickly. Children tend to learn nouns more easily than verbs, even in more verb-friendly languages such as in Chinese. Rules of grammar may be misapplied. And so an example would be like over-regularization is found in statements such as I go there or I did that, in which adding ed to the end of the word is used to indicate past tense, and it's obviously being used incorrectly. Do you remember Vygotsky from a couple weeks ago? He was the one who talked about the zone of proximal development. This is the potential a child may achieve through guided participation. Language, both verbal and nonverbal, of this guidance. So do you ever talk to yourself? When and why? Chances are you talk to yourself as an adult only when you want to express an emotion or maybe even clarify a thought that's kind of running in your head. The inner speech is not the same as the speech as you use when communicating with others. It's short and to the point. But when you were learning to use language, you may have struggled as you began to use words to communicate ideas to others. You probably spoke aloud. So sometimes that whole concept of like thinking out loud, that's where the child does it a lot more, where the adult has it more filtered. You may have talked to yourself with like a running commentary about your own activities and feelings as you learn to think using words. Gradually, this egocentric speech, spoken when alone, became private speech or thinking in language. Inner speech is only spoken aloud if thoughts need to be clarified or emotions expressed. Think about it. Did you use words? Now we turn our attention towards psychosocial development in early childhood. We'll explore concepts like family life, identity, and self-concept. Self-concept is one's perception of self. So we aren't born with a self-concept. It develops through our interactions with the world and other people. Usually these others or those close to us are like parents, siblings, maybe grandparents, peers. Let's look at two theories of self based on interaction. So Charles Horton Cooley used the metaphor of a mirror or looking glass when describing this process. Our self-concept develops when we look at how those around us respond to us, and how we look, what we say, and what we do. We use their reaction to like make judgments about ourselves and our relationships with them too. If those around us respond favorably to us, we'll form a positive sense of self. But if those around us respond with like constantly with criticism and insult, we interpret that as evidence that we may not be good or acceptable. But those around us may not respond to us based on more than our performance or worth. So perhaps they don't notice what we do well or are reluctant to comment on it. So as a result of this, you may have an inaccurate self-concept about yourself. There may be certain periods in life in which we are more self-conscious or concerned about how other people view us or think about us. Early childhood may be one of those times. As a child, they're trying to piece together their sense of self, and they're constantly looking to the people around them to reaffirm some of those concepts. George Herbert Mead also focused on social interaction as important for developing a sense of self. He divided the self into two parts, the I, or the spontaneous part of the self, and we are technically creative and internally motivated, and the me, or the part of the self that takes into account what other people think. The key to living well is to find ways to give expression to the I and with the approval of the me. In other words, find out how to be creative and yourself and what you do within the guidance of society. The I is born. But the me develops through social interactions and a process called taking the role of the other. A child first comes to take the role of a significant other person, typically a parent or sibling. A child who has been told to not do something may be found saying no to himself or herself. Gradually, the child will come to understand how like this generalization or society at large comes to view actions and behaviors. Now, behavior is not just wrong according to to the significant other person. It is wrong as a rule of society that we all kind of agree to. In this way, cultural expectations become part of that judgment of self. The ability to see oneself through the eyes of others can be witnessed during this stage, and it's based off of the children's like social interactions with the people around them. Mead described these stages as like imitation, play, and game. So in the imitation stage, the child simply mimics the actions of others, whether it's behavior or sayings, they're just mimicking. In the play stage, the child is able to take the role of another person, and they're learning how to act in a single role. So this is where like pretend play is really big. The child can see himself or herself by other person in the situation. In the game stage, the child can take the role of the other in many situations. So they're starting to kind of understand the complexity of different roles. The child understands what is expected of them in a variety of situations. So for example, the shortstop in baseball knows how to interact with the pitcher, the player on first base, or other positions. Early self-concepts can be like really exaggerated at this time. A child may want to be the biggest or be able to jump the highest or have the longest hair. This exaggerated sense of self is like external. The child emphasizes outward expressions and responses is developing the sense of self. Older children tend to become more realistic in their sense of self as they start comparing their own behaviors with that of like other people. Erikson views early childhood as a time of building autonomy and taking initiative. The child wants to think of an activity and carry it out without interference of others. And so this is where sometimes when they're playing together, they might have a hard time because they want to act out the scenario according to how they perceive it. And so they're still learning how to take directions or even like other people's ideas. They haven't done this very well just yet. Early childhood is also a time of developing gender identification or like a sense of self based on gender. You may recall Freud's theory of phallic stage in which the child develops a sense of like masculine or feminine energy. I believe her name's Nancy Chardoro, believed that mothers promote gender-specific behaviors in the way that they interact with their sons and daughters. Daughters are kept close and dependent, while sons are encouraged to be independent and assertive. Cognitive theory suggests that children actively seek their gender roles through like a gender schema in which they sort the world into like male and female categories. And this is where like objects and activities and colors and mannerisms, they start to perceive it as like this is what girls do or boys do. Learning theories focus on the way in which children are reinforced for gender stereotypical behavior and how modeling and maybe media images promote some of these gender like stereotypical behaviors. The focus is on how like society imposes gender expectations on children. So not necessarily that they had to, but how are they getting all these social cues from their parents, from movies, from toys, all these things that are reinforcing or sometimes even imposing these expectations on them. So how is gender taught? The training is said to begin in infancy as parents treat their sons and daughters differently. In some cultures, it means cuddling or speaking to daughters, where directing son towards outside activities. Sons tend to be given more freedom and less supervision than daughters, and daughters may be given unnecessary assistance, thus undermining maybe sometimes their confidence. Teachers call on boys more often in the classroom, and schools may direct students in certain fields of study based on gender rather than their actual ability. Friends have a different code of behavior for girls and for boys. Girls focuses on the closeness of friendships, where boys may focus more on competition. So the question is gender taught, or do children seek out how to behave based on their sex? Gender expectations are taught and messages are presented to them in media, in school, among friends, and by family members. But children also vary in the extent to which they follow the rules that are presented to them. There's an interactive role between the individual and society's expectation with respect to gender. This is called doing gender. It means that we approach these expectations and respond to them in a variety of ways, depending on individual motives and attributes. I want you to think about your parents or guardians. How were they when it comes to discipline? Were they consistent? Were they on the same page with each other? Here are two models of parenting styles. You may be able to identify your own parents to some extent in these descriptions in the coming slides. Of course, these models represent clear categories. Real parents are going to fall somewhere in between these. Diane Baumrinn's model classifies parents in several ways based on the amount and direction of communication that a parent has with their children, their level of warmth, and the level of maturity expected from the child. The authoritarian model is a traditional one in which the parent is in control. Children are expected to be obedient and respectful. These parents have low warmth, but they have high maturity demands for their children. The permissive model is one in which parents allow children to make the rules. These parents show a good deal of warmth, but they have trouble setting limits with their kids. The authoritative model is parenting that is strict, within reason, and that is accompanied by affection. Children have some say in making rules, and the exchanges are warm. This is also known as democratic parenting and is the model favored by this theorist. The parenting program called Love and Logic is a good example of this model. Uninvolved parents are unresponsive and non-demanding, and as a consequence, their children may have difficulty in social relationships, schools, and sometimes. LeMaster's and Dufresne's model is more focused on what parents are trying to accomplish when they're parenting, and it offers a glimpse into the psychological motivation of the parent. And so this model suggests that parents' psychological needs rather than the child's development are frequently being addressed when they are parenting. So here are a couple models. The martyr is the type of parent who will do anything for their child, even those things that the child should and could do on their own. This is to help the parent feel in control through self-sacrifice, but there is this expectation that the child will be in debt to them because of their self-sacrifice and their actions for the child. The pal is lonely and wants a friend. The pal lets the child do what they want in hopes that the child will spend more time with them. And I think what this does is it satisfies this need for companionship that maybe the parent doesn't have. The police officer or the drill sergeant wants direct control and wants to give the child many obedience tests. Obedience tests are often meaningless, but the purpose of them is to show the child who's in control. The teacher counselor part is one where pays a little bit maybe too much attention to what the experts have to say about parenting, and the teacher counselor takes all responsibility from the child's behavior and thinks that if they just do the right thing according to this expert, they will have this perfect child. And the athletic coach is the preferred model, and it basically involves being objective and consistent in parenting and allowing the children to do learning by doing. So what is the best model? It turns out that showing concern, warmth, and support is the most important ingredient. The way this care and concern is demonstrated depends on the culture. So you're not going to see this concern, warmth, and support looking exactly the same way. It might look different in the United States as compared to different parts of Latin America or Europe, but those are the primary components. As of 2009, 65% of mothers with children under the age 6 and 77% of mothers with children between 6 and 17 work outside the home in the United States. Since the dramatic increase of women in the labor force, we've seen many studies that evaluate the impact of childcare on child development. Most of the attention has been devoted to looking at like formal preschools and daycare programs, and for example, they focus on the teacher-child ratio, the type of environment, and the activities that the teachers facilitate. The conclusion has been that daycare that is stimulating, provides adequate attention to the children, is beneficial, and sometimes superior to the world of children that are staying at home. In some parts of the world, child care concerns are more about like safety and healthcare. So market women in Liberia are women who sell items on street or market vendors. These women are providers for their families and also take care of their children. Daycare is not available to them, so their children accompany them to the markets. These markets can be crowded and often near waste dumps. Recently, there has been a nationwide effort to improve the conditions for children in marketplaces and to offer like social services such as nutrition and health care for children. The thing you just have to know is that child care concerns vary throughout the world. You know, in the United States, it might also be about affordability, where for others it might be, like I said, nutrition and health care. The last thing I want to talk about is stress and development. Some amount of stress is normal in the lives of children. Normal stress includes everyday frustrations and disappointments and even minor illness, minor cuts or bruises. These stresses can in fact be good life lessons for children and they do not cause harm. But toxic stress is long-term and undermines a child's sense of safety and support. And this might come from living in an abusive household or one that's just filled with neglect. Or it might be to a lack of safety and fear that results from living in like crime-ridden communities or maybe children who have come from war. Prolonged stress leads to the production of stress hormones such as cortisol. Normally, these hormones help the body prepare to take action and to kind of get out of harm's way. So that whole like fight or flight instinct that we have. But prolonged exposure reduces our immunity to diseases and leads to problems with like digestion, blood pressure, and even like muscle tension. In early childhood, our brains are building and the systems are wiring, and it's because of the response of our environment. A child who undergoes like chronic, intense stress can develop like a low threshold to stress within their brain. A child may be nervous or maybe even sometimes like hypervigilant. Having like a caring, supportive parent or other caregivers can reduce the impact of toxic stress.